Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone participating in this morning's webinar. My name is Laura Malcolm. I'm a nonprofit audit manager at Gelman, Rosenberg Freedman, and I will be today's moderator. I'd like to start off with some quick housekeeping items and explain what participants need to do to earn CPE credit for this webinar. For the best sound quality, we highly recommend you connect by phone instead of your computer. If you have any technical questions or issues during the webinar, please use the Q&A function to speak with our webinar administrator for assistance. Technical assistance is also available from WebEx at the number shown here. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and made available on our website following the event. The slides will also be posted at this address, grfcpa.com/webinars. Webinar participants seeking CPE credit for this presentation must complete and submit a short evaluation survey that will appear automatically immediately following the webinar. There are 3 CPE words provided throughout the presentation. Please write down these 3 CPE words when they are given. They will not be provided again. You'll be asked to recall these words in order to receive credit. Also, if you have an active pop-up blocker, please take a moment and disable it now so that it will not block the survey. Any technical questions about the survey may be addressed to Dominic Acosta at dacosta@grfcpa.com. As the title of the webinar implies, today's learning objective is to provide attendees with a better understanding of data security and risk management. 1 CPE credit is available to attendees of today's webinar. With all that said, welcome to today's webinar, Manage Risk to Your Organization with Effective Data Security. Now I'd like to introduce our 2 fantastic speakers for today's presentation. Ricardo Trujillo is a nonprofit audit partner with Gelman, Rosenberg Freedman and leads the firm's Information Technology Audit Initiative and helps for-profit and nonprofit organizations bridge the gap between business and technology by carefully analyzing IT infrastructures. He also presents to the nonprofit community on cybersecurity-related topics. Mac Lillard is a nonprofit audit senior with Gelman, Rosenberg Freedman and also performs a variety of audit work and agreed-upon procedures to ensure the client's internal controls are appropriate and compliant with donor requirements over the management of their funds. Okay, at this time, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Ricardo.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in today's webinar, which will help better understand data security and risk management within your organization. I wanted to start with a short video, which has been developed by Cisco, but due to the WebEx limitations, we're not going to be able to stream it. However, I highly encourage everyone to watch it. The link which is on the slide right now will be emailed to all the attendees at the end of the presentation. Or simply you can go to YouTube and search Anatomy of an IoT Attack, and IoT is the Internet of Things. And everyone should be able to find it at that location. Or you can also go to the Cisco website, where it's also available on their website as well. But as a quick summary, the video really describes how attacks can and are taking place in today's environment. It reinforces how devices which are connected to the Internet or the Internet of Things are being used for cyber attacks. Now, these devices, and sometimes many times organizations don't think about it. It could be a thermostat that's really connected to the Internet, or it could be a printer that's Wi-Fi enabled. Now, these devices often lack critical device protections, and many times organizations fail to even identify them, as I just briefly talked about. Now, this pinpoints why it's so important to take full inventory of all assets, physical and digital, to be able to identify vulnerabilities. Now, Mac will get into the inventory of assets later in the presentation, but I highly recommend people and all the attendees go and search for the video. It's really, really interesting. Now, with that, we are going to talk about some hard dollar figures and complaints received and reported by the FBI on their 2017 Internet Crime Report. So the 2017 Internet Crime Report, which was released in May 2018, it looks like we're having a little bit of a sound issue here. I'm sorry, guys. Can we mute ourselves? So the FBI Internet Crime Report, which was released in May 2018, shows the hard losses on an annualized basis. And you can see that the numbers continue to go up. Now, as everyone can see, the report released revealed that the center received more than 300,000 complaints last year in 2017 alone, and also it reports losses of more than $1.4 billion throughout the last 5 years at a minimum. It also reports the most common crime types reported by victims, and also the most crime types in terms of dollars that are reported by victims. So I highly recommend it. The link of the report is down below. If anyone is interested to dive in a little deeper into it with all the details that it has, it's really interesting information as well. Also, privacyrights.org, which is a nonprofit organization, maintains a great chronology of data breaches since 2005, which is also interesting data to look at as well. Finally, another point that I wanted to bring up is that Verizon Data Breach Report puts the average loss per record at about $200 per record. So one can do the math simply by thinking of their donor database, for instance, where each donor would be considered to be a record. The numbers can add up very quickly, as you can see, and you can easily put an organization out of business if proper security controls are not well implemented. And with that, we'll talk about the agenda. So here's the list of topics that we will cover in today's webinar. The last two topics are from the regulatory point of view, and that's the PCI and also the GDPR. The last two topics are from the regulations by government. Regulations by government agencies is seen one of the threats that organizations are having right now due to the uncertainty of regulations being implemented. So organizations don't know when government is going to come in and implement a regulation, and that's why it's seen more as a threat. And change can create instability. So in the reactive model of regulation, governments respond to instability with regulation, right? However, the preemptive model of regulation is increasing common as authorities seek to manage the changing world in order to prevent instability. That's really how they're tackling this. The GDPR, which Mark will discuss later in the presentation, is a clear example of governments responding to instability. How can we control this? And they come up and institute the GDPR, the PCI, payment card industry, data security standards, for instance. Now, let's talk about implementing proper security controls within the organization. Organizations need to understand what the threats are so proper controls can be implemented. And here's a list of some of those right now. So patch applications. To do this, a complete list of applications is required. Inventory of those applications, inventory of devices. Also, you need to make sure, or organizations need to make sure that the patches are appropriately tested before deploying them. Many times, software or devices come up with patches, firmware gets upgraded, and organizations need to really make sure that before they apply a patch, that those devices are still going to be working once the patch is applied. Many times patches are applied, and it could take down the whole network if things are not done correctly. Consistency in the application of controls. What do we mean by that? Well, let's say the organization has antivirus, and only 90% of the devices have antivirus. Well, then that's not being consistent on the application of controls, if you will. Automation where possible. Also, physical and software security. So properly locking the server room, for instance, and restricting access, for instance, would be considered a control on the physical security. Also, restricting access for software. Again, it could be the domain controller. So usernames, passwords, multi-factor authentication, or MFA. Those are security controls that need to be implemented. How often are the passwords being changed? Do they have a strong policy for the passwords where different characters are used, that they're long enough to be able to be secured? Also, manage vendor risks. Does the organization have a well-executed SLA, service level agreement, with all third-party providers? Nowadays, organizations are moving more towards the cloud, moving the data to the cloud, and that's a third-party provider. Well, what happens if that third-party provider goes out of business? What happens if the data becomes inaccessible? Or is a proper SLA executed that dictates whether or not the organization is going to be able to access the data and obtain the data and move it to a different service provider if that's the case? What happens if, does the organization know when backups are being done on that data that's in the cloud? Can the data be restored on a regular basis? CISecurity.org is a great tool, is a great resource, is a nonprofit which provides great tools for control implementation, and organizations can simply go there and obtain great checklists and stuff like that to be able to help them implement great security controls. Cybersecurity is about training, it's about awareness, it's about review and policies. Now, does the organization have a formal IT policies and procedures in place? If not, we'll be happy to provide a sample of these policies and procedures at the end of the presentation, or you can simply just email us directly, and we'll be happy to provide those to you, because I know those are really extensive, and they could be very hard to start putting together. So when you start with a template, it definitely helps out. But remember that once these IT policies and procedures are implemented, they need to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. Organizations cannot just implement the IT policies and procedures and sort of like forget about them. This is a changing environment. Things are changing rapidly and constantly. Right now, organizations are dealing with the cloud. They're dealing with many different other things. So very important to be able to review and make sure that those policies and procedures are up to date. Part of the organization's IT policies and procedures, it's an incident handling program as depicted on this slide. This program stems directly from the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then once an incident is identified or discovered, and what do we mean by an incident? It could be a breach, it could be a virus, and so on and so forth. The organization needs to be able to respond to the incident and recover as quickly as possible from it to be able to avoid business disruption, which can be very costly. So that's where you have to go through this, you know, the identify, protect, and detect, and respond and recover. And this is stemming directly from the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is really useful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mac so he can get into the details of keeping a technology asset inventory for the organizations, which was one of the security controls that I briefly touched on before. So Mac?
Thank you very much, Ricardo and Laura, for the introductions, and thank you everyone for joining us in today's webinar. Really quick, it seems like we're getting a lot of feedback over the audio, so if any of the participants have an active mic, if you could just be sure to mute that just so that everyone has the best audio quality. So to start off, I'm just going to go through the importance of building a comprehensive IT asset inventory and then managing and monitoring those IT assets. So one thing every organization should do, regardless of your size, regardless of the complexity of your IT infrastructure, is you want to build a comprehensive inventory of all of your IT assets, all of the hardware, software, all the platforms your organization utilizes, applications. If you have user licenses for any of these softwares or platforms, who has those licenses, what laptops or desktops they're installed on, and just creating a comprehensive inventory of literally every single system your organization utilizes. The next thing you'll want to do is create a risk schema in order to determine what your critical systems are and the effect of any sort of breach or failure should one occur. This risk scheme should take into account various factors, the main one being, what kind of data is stored within the hardware, within the software, what kind of data it processes. Anything that handles accounting, financial, anything that stores personally identifiable information is obviously going to be a higher risk, and that's going to be one of your critical systems, as opposed to, if you have one obsolete floater laptop that your organization holds on to in case, another one fails. Obviously, something like that is going to have less of a security risk to you all. And then implementing policies and procedures, which I'll actually touch on in the next slide as well, but implementing policies and procedures to monitor and make sure that everything is up to date. If there are required updates for any of your softwares, making sure that everyone's software is up to the most recent version possible. If there are any patches applied, what patches, which laptops or desktops need these patches. And another thing that you can take into account when creating this inventory listing is when you put together your listing of laptops and desktops and what versions and softwares are all running on is whether or not that has gotten the most recent patch, whether it's up to date on the most current possible version, and making sure that everything is just up to date and accounted for. And lastly is just doing periodic performance evaluation of your hardware, software, platforms. If your organization began using a platform 5 to 10 years ago, there's a good chance that there's another platform out there. There's another organization that offers that platform, and it might be better suited for your organization in terms of the capabilities of that platform, in terms of the cost to your organization. So just periodically reviewing and making sure that everything is performing the way your organization needs it to. To go into the policies and procedures to implement over your technology asset inventories, I would say that the most crucial is to ensure that somebody is taking ownership of this inventory listing. If you have an information systems manager or an IT director, ensuring that they're periodically reviewing this on a monthly or a quarterly basis. If you don't have somebody within your organization that fills that role, making sure that the CFO or the CEO is in charge of it or has delegated that to someone within the organization. Review the physical inventory within your organization, whether you have a storage room or wherever you hold everything, and making sure that it agrees entirely to this detailed listing that you all have. And then another thing to implement is that you want to have a ticketing system to monitor any sort of IT issues that you have. Any crashing of laptops, any issues with remote connectivity, any issues with software not functioning properly. Log all of the crashes and any of the failures. Determine when it happened, what IT assets were affected, how long it was out of commission, how long it took to remediate this issue. And that way, at the end of the year, you have a comprehensive listing of everything that failed this year. So that way, you can plan on what needs to be replaced, what needs to be upgraded, and that way your organization has a better idea of everything that you need going into the next year. And lastly is disposing of your IT assets. There's various ways to do this. Most organizations are going to try to recoup some funds of this, whether it's selling it back, selling it to another organization. If you're implementing an employee buyback program where you offer any sort of obsolete IT assets out to your employees at a severely discounted price, there's many ways to do this, but ensuring that you're disposing of them properly in terms of making sure that there's no sensitive data when you get rid of this asset, making sure that either the hard drive is destroyed or it is completely wiped. And if your organization is just simply disposing of these, throwing them out, making sure that you're doing it in a financial and environmentally sound way. There are organizations out there that you can pay a pretty small fee just to recycle your old IT assets. They're called e-cyclers, electronics recyclers, pretty self-explanatory, but just making sure that you're doing it in the most appropriate and environmentally conscious manner. And then lastly is just keeping your hardware up to date, hardware and software. Your firm organization should implement a process for reviewing and upgrading all of your IT assets. Maybe if you have a whole lot of laptops that are in use, if you replace 5 laptops a year every year, and that way the old, obsolete, slow laptops that you've been using, these are getting replaced and getting updated with newer, faster, more capable technologies. And then one of the most important things, and that we've noticed through doing these IT risk assessments, is just making sure that there's no disconnect between management, the board, and the IT department if your organization has one. Budgeting for IT is crucial because, as most people know, IT assets are extremely expensive. So making sure that the board is aware of all of the needs of the organization, making sure that they are aware of any of these projects and the funds that need to be allocated there.
Right, and I wanted to add to what Mac was just talking about. Also, it's a good idea that once the inventory list has been completed, both on the physical and application device inventory, and Mac made a mention about this, but it's good to prioritize that list. You know, how important are those assets and applications, and how much focus do they need from an IT perspective to be able to secure them properly moving forward.
All right, thank you both. This is very good information. We've come to our first polling question. Does your organization have a technology asset inventory? And the possible responses are yes, no, or I don't know. So please take a moment now to answer, and while we do this, I will provide our first CPE word. The first CPE word is technology. If you'd like to receive CPE credit, please jot this word down because you'll need it for later. Again, the first CPE word is technology, T-E-C-H-N-O-L-O-G-Y. Please be sure to spell correctly. Spelling does count. And while we wait for the answers to come in and for the poll to close, I'd like to inform our participants of a one-day boot camp that Gelman, Rosenberg, and Freedman is hosting, which explores what many of the area's nonprofit executives perceive as challenges for the industry now and over the next several years. So for more information,
I also wanted to remind our webinar audience to please mute yourselves. I know we're getting some background noise, so double check your mics in your settings so you can mute the background noise to make it a pleasant experience for everyone. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. Okay, so it looks like our polling is coming to an end, and at this time I'll go ahead and turn that back over to Mac.
All right, and so from here, I'm just going to touch briefly on cyber insurance and mitigating risk. So the first thing to understand is what protection do you have through your third-party providers in terms of cyber insurance? A common misconception is that a lot of people think that they're protected through their ISPs. However, ISPs typically only cover against certain issues that can be, directly traceable back to the internet service provider. There's a very complex definition of computer fraud and how, ISPs may define that in order to sort of pass the buck in terms of insurance coverage. So one thing that your organization needs to consider is just what kind of data you're storing. If you're an organization that is storing HIPAA data or any sort of personally identifiable information, cyber insurance is definitely an avenue you want to explore, because the loss, not only organizational reputation, but in terms of monetary fines, the cost of a breach, these things can be crippling. As anybody who heard of many of the various breaches over the past few years, there have been not only legal fees that are assessed on these, but fines for any sort, the amount of personally identifiable information that's leaked. So if this is something that you think might be applicable to your organization, performing a cost-benefit analysis of cyber insurance is always something to consider. Obviously, if your organization doesn't store a lot of personally identifiable information, this might not be an avenue for you. This might be too expensive. The cost versus the benefit won't be there. So it's just something to explore and something to think about. Going from that, we're going to go into risk from third-party providers and ensuring that your vendors are secure and that they're the best possible vendor for you. And this is also going to kind of reinforce some of the information I went through just going over the inventory listings, because it's the same kind of policies and procedures you want to go through in terms of determining who your critical vendors are, just like you would with your critical IT assets, and doing the proper management and oversight over these. So determining who your critical vendors are, you're going to want to give everyone a risk rating. Determine what service it is that they're providing to you. How drastically this will affect you in the event that this vendor doesn't meet their contract requirements. If you have a vendor who's providing all of your cloud storage, that person is going to be much more high risk and high impact as opposed to one of your vendors who provides office supplies on a monthly basis. So one thing to consider is putting together a vendor management program. And as you can see, these 4 bullet points, risk management, due diligence, contract structuring, and oversight are all things that go into that. And if you look at the illustration to the right, that just goes through a high-level process over due diligence. That also kind of incorporates a risk assessment into it. So just performing the risk assessment for any vendor is probably the most important part of the vendor management program, ensuring that every vendor that you send out an RFP or you try to get a bid from is capable, making sure that they haven't had any historical issues. So you want to review any SOC reports they've had, and not only looking at any historical issues they've had, but making sure that they've actually made attempts to remediate these issues. If these are just issues that continually show up in reports, why aren't they fixing them? And then looking at user reviews, trying to look at an organization that might be similar to yours and seeing how they felt about this software or this vendor, whatever it is that they may be providing you. And as part of this vendor management program, it's important to obviously document the good vendors that you end up using and contracting with, but it's also important to note any of the negative vendors, anybody who couldn't meet the contract requirements, because if you end up going down the road a couple of years and you're procuring the same service or you're going out for bid again, you'll at least know that you can just ignore these vendors because they couldn't meet the contract requirements the first go around. So doing your due diligence also is, part of the risk assessment process, looking at historical issues and SOC reports. But due diligence also takes into account wanting to look at various vendors. You don't just want to look at the 3 vendors that pop up on Google first. Look at the vendors that are, tailored specifically towards your type of organization. If you're a nonprofit organization, if you're a for-profit organization, a membership association, what the vendors' history is like dealing with organizations of your size, structure, and needs. And then determining what your needs are goes into the contract structuring. And this also goes back to having no disconnect between management, IT, and the board of directors. When structuring these contracts, you need to know exactly what it is that your organization needs and what this vendor is going to be providing you. A lot of IT providers, information systems vendors, they like to bundle a lot of their services together. Your internet service provider might try to offer you some cloud management or some firewall or just IT general maintenance or anything like that. So just making sure that the contract is structured in a way that benefits your organization best is crucial. Making sure that there's no sort of bundled fees in there that you're paying that your organization isn't going to utilize. And that it's just going to be kind of a sunk cost for you. And then just like the inventory asset management, you want to perform proper oversight over your vendor management program, making sure that they're meeting your expectations, your requirements. Have there been any complaints within your organization from your employees in terms of if it's an IT maintenance provider, how long are they taking to get back to you when you've reported an issue? Have there been any issues outside of your organization? Have there been any negative reports coming out about this vendor? And just making sure, doing the proper monitoring and oversight to make sure that these vendors stay the best vendor for your organization. And then going into the due diligence and the risk assessment also involves procurement procedures. Going back to the bid solicitation, just making sure that you're getting bids from the most suitable vendors. We would recommend a minimum of 3 to 5 for any sort of critical service. That being your internet service provider, If you're outsourcing your IT maintenance and management, you want to make sure that these vendors are most suited for your organization. If these are vendors that specialize in organizations that have 200 employees and they don't have experience working with an organization that has only 20 employees, making sure that their fees aren't higher for your organization just because of the amount of employees you have. Maybe there's a vendor that has more experience in working with small organizations and can offer a lower fee. And then going into that is the evaluation of competency. Is this vendor able to meet your goals? Again, do they have past issues? Have organizations of the same size and structure of yours, have they enjoyed working with this vendor, or have they found that this vendor falls short of their expectations? And then at the end of the day, you typically want the lowest cost provider, making sure that your organization isn't paying for services that you're not actually utilizing. And if you're not going with the lowest cost provider, what is the reason for that? Is there an additional need or an additional service that this vendor can't provide you that you will need? Is it worth exploring with that vendor? Is it something that they might be able to offer you, but the fee is higher? Maybe it would be better to put out a separate RFP process for that and use a different vendor for that service. And then to go along with the risk from the third-party providers, if in the event that there's a breach or a failure or one of these vendors goes out of business, making sure that you have appropriate business continuity and contingency plans in place. And this again goes back to identifying those critical vendors. If your entire network crashes, who are the most important vendors that you need to contact to get everything up and running again? Is all of your data backed up? Do you have alternative procedures in place to ensure that your organization doesn't just completely shut down? So this brings in business continuity plans as well as disaster recovery plans, determining the effect of any sort of breach or crash, what data you might lose, what data is vulnerable, whether or not in the event of a crash or a breach, are there additional measures in place to protect personally identifiable information or financial information that could cripple your organization if lost? And then just mitigate, transfer, and avoid any of these risks associated with this. And another thing is to determine the minimum allowable downtime for your organization, and that's exactly what it sounds like, is how much time your organization can be offline without having a significant financial effect on you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ricardo to discuss some security awareness training.
Thank you, Mac. And also, I wanted to add a little bit to the third-party providers. Once the agreement has been signed and an SLA has been entered into, or even before the agreement has been entered into, it might be a good idea to review those SLAs with counsel, especially the most critical ones, just to make sure that the organization is not going to be in jeopardy if at the end of the day the services are not provided or the data is at risk. So something to really keep in mind for that particular, for the SLAs. I've seen organizations thinking that they were going to be able to access their data or so on and so forth, and then at the end of the day, the SLA protected the third-party provider, and the organization couldn't do much about it because they were not sure about what they were signing. So I just wanted to add to that. Now the security awareness training, we wanted to touch base on that because this is a huge security control that should be implemented by all organizations. Research shows that investing in security awareness training not only decreases the likelihood that the organization will face a breach, but it also lowers the cost if a breach actually happens within the organization. Now, to protect the organization, they have to do a better job, or organizations have to do a better job at educating employees on how to identify risk and also how to react appropriately when something actually does happen. We still continue to know, everybody knows that the humans continue to be the weakest link in the data security chain. And to be able to fix this, organizations need security awareness programs that are designed to educate, also designed to raise awareness, and also designed to change the behavior of the organization's employees. That's what security awareness training program is all about. And that needs to go all the way from the entry level to the executives and also to the information security officers. So it needs to encompass everybody within the organization. Now, the Adaptive Awareness Framework, which is designed by MediaPro, and is highly aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I just spoke briefly before, it offers organizations an actionable and measurable way to introduce better security awareness within the organization. It also organizes and integrates a variety of well-known and widely dispersed standards into a single overarching framework that is easily to implement, is also easy to manage, and is also easily adaptable to the organization. MediaPro conducted a survey back in 2016, and it's interesting because in their survey, more than 1,000 employees across the United States, they surveyed more than 1,000 employees across the U.S., it revealed that 88% lack the awareness to stop preventable cyber accidents. I mean, that's a pretty big number. In addition, the Verizon Enterprise Data Breach Investigation Report, for example, found that 30% of phishing emails were actually opened. 30% of those emails were actually opened, and this number probably continues to increase. So we need organizations to really adapt a good security awareness program. Now, falling for scam emails is just a sampling of the dangers that are posed by employees lacking security and privacy training. So all it takes is an employee to click on the wrong link or send the wrong document to the wrong person, thinking it comes from the CEO or the president of the organization. And without this awareness training, they don't know. They have no idea what's going on, and they think it's coming from the right source. Untrained employees are putting their companies at serious risk of material loss due to a data breach or other cyber incident. The danger of sensitive client or customer data compromised by a data breach threatens the organization of all sizes and industries. It's not just large nonprofit organizations. It really threatens everybody, and we need to make sure that organizations implement this. Year after year, massive breaches affecting millions of people continue to make headlines. I mean, we have seen it on and on and on every time. There's reports of lost revenue, reports of lost customers, lost donors, and loss of reputation usually follow when something like that tends to happen, or people just being let go of their positions. So we believe that if organizations are really going to change behavior, they need to do 4 things, and really they're pinpointed over here on the slide from the MediaPro's Adaptive Awareness Framework, and it's to analyze, and that's by using the data to inform the awareness program. Also, it needs to plan, which is by drawing a roadmap for planning the awareness program. Then it needs to continue the training, which is building the training and achieves real behavior change. And finally, it needs to reinforce, which is battling the forgetting curve. I mean, this is a total circle that needs to continue, and it's a good idea to implement this when employees and staff are onboarded on the organization, and then it needs to be set up on a cycle. It can not just be done when people are just hired, but also it should be done on an ongoing basis, at least every 6 months at a minimum, because that's the only way that this is going to sink in and stick with the employees moving forward, and it's going to avoid a particular breach from happening. With that, we'll go to our next polling question, so I'll turn it over to Laura. Laura?
Thanks, Ricardo. Okay, we've arrived at our second polling question. Does your organization have a formal security awareness training program in place? And the possible answers are yes, no, or I don't know. So please kindly take a moment to submit your answer, and while you all are doing so, I will provide the second CPE word. The second CPE word is plan, P-L-A-N, plan. Again, the second CPE word is plan. Please write this word down for later if you'd like to get that CPE credit, and remember that spelling does count. Okay, now as the polling closes and we wait for the answers.
What, Papa?
You want to follow the mom's advice to get all those?
She gave them to me.
No, no. I see you open.
Sorry, everyone. We're hearing some background
Follow
noise.
you.
If you can please
Go ahead.
mute your microphone, that would be very appreciative to the other webinar participants. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo. Okay, I would just like to invite everyone to join us September 13th for the next webinar in our monthly webinar series. Partners Trevor Williams and Walt Darren-Galsey will discuss topic 606, revenue from contracts with customers. You can find more information and registration at grfcpa.com/events. And I believe the pollings are now closed, so I'll go ahead and pass the mic back over to Ricardo.
Thank you, Laura. So this will take us to the next topic here, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. And hopefully this is familiar with most of the people attending our webinar today. But just in case you're not, what is PCI? So PCI is a set of security standards which are designed to ensure that all organizations that accept, process, store, or transmit credit card information, and that's also debit card, by the way, maintain a secure environment. And these standards are administered and managed by PCI Security Standards Council, as we can see here on the slide. But who does PCI DSS apply to? It really applies to any organization, regardless of the size or number of transactions that accepts, transmits, or stores any cardholder data. So the minute the organization is touching credit card information, it already needs to be in compliance with PCI DSS standards. Now, what are the different levels based on the number of credit card transactions? And they go from level 1 through 4. I'll quickly summarize each one of them. Level 1 is for those organizations that are processing more than 6 million credit card transactions annually. And remember, this is not about a dollars figure here. It's really the number of transactions. So if you have organizations that are processing $2 or $3 credit card transactions, well, each transaction counts as one, as opposed to like looking at $6 million of transactions. It's really 6 million transactions. So I want to make sure that everybody's clear with that. It's conducted, now the PCI audit needs to be conducted. An internal audit needs to be conducted once a year, and also they need to submit a PCI scan by an approved scanning vendor. That needs to be done. The PCI scanning needs to be done by all of the levels anyways, levels 2, 3, and 4. Levels 2 are for those organizations between 1 and 6 million credit card transactions. For the levels 2 to 4, they don't have to go through the required internal audit, but they do need to submit once a year a self-assessment questionnaire, or SAQ. And depending on how many transactions he handles and how they're handled, there are many different SAQs that need to be filled out, and some could be very, very, very extensive. So those need to be done by levels 2. Levels 3, which is between 20,000 and 1 million transactions, and level 4, which is anybody handling less than 20,000 transactions. So they still need to go through those SAQs. What are the penalties for non-compliance? Well, they can range anywhere from $5,000 to $100,000 per month, and the PCI compliance will fine the bank, and that the bank eventually is going to pass down those fines down to the organization. So it's our advice to really reach out to your banking institution to figure out if the organization needs to be in compliance with the PCI DSS, and if so, then the organization needs to figure out how to become compliant right away. There's 6 goals and 12 requirements from the PCI standards. The 6 goals are securing the network, securing the cardholder data, the vulnerability management, the access control, network monitoring and testing, and also the information security. And within those 6 goals are the 12 different PCI requirements. For instance, under securing the network, one of the things that is a requirement is, it's a firewall configuration installed and maintained, or system passwords changed, meaning when they come from the factory, they have like a default username and password. Have those been changed and not simply vendor provider? Under the secure cardholder data, how is the cardholder information protected? And it needs to be protected. So here are some of the the requirements. Another one is, how is the access to cardholder data and network resources tracked and monitored? So once organizations really go through this PCI compliance, either an SAQ or a more formalized audit, it really helps the organization set up a good set framework of IT policies and procedures. So, and chances are, if you're taking credit cards via the organization's website, and then they're being transferred to a third-party provider, being a PayPal or whatever, you are still liable for PCI, and you need to be going through the PCI compliance standards to be able to obtain this certificate. Chances are it's probably less than 6 million transactions unless the organization is pretty big, but you still need to go through the SAQs. And with that, the next slide depicts a little bit more about what PCI compliance is. I'm not going to get into detail over here because I've already covered it. But it's something that really needs to be discussed among the team and among management to figure out, is this something that we are being compliant with, because the fines could be pretty significant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mac. Oh, no, we'll go over to the polling question. I'm sorry. Polling question number 3. Laura?
Wonderful. Thanks, Ricardo. Okay, this is our third and final polling question. Has your organization gone through an IT risk assessment? Yes, no, or I don't know are your possible answers. Please take a moment and choose and submit one of those. And while participants are recording their responses, I will provide the last and final CPE word. The last CPE word is rules. Again, the last CPE word is rules. R-U-L-E-S, rules. And while we wait for the results of this polling question, I'd just like to remind everyone to enter those 3 CPE words that were given throughout this presentation into that survey that will immediately follow the webinar in order to receive your CPE certificate. If you have any questions regarding the CPE credit, you may email Dominic Acosta at dacosta@grfcpa.com. Okay, and with that, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Mac.
All right, and so the second regulatory topic that we're going to cover, and the last topic of the webinar, is General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. So what you want to know about GDPR is that this became effective May 25th of 2018, and this sets guidelines for the collection and processing of personally identifiable information for individuals within the European Union. So the most frequently asked question is just what makes this different from any other sort of set of regulations out there? And what makes this different is that it places a specific emphasis on any sort of organization that stores or manages data, whether or not it's your organization's own financial or personally identifiable information, or if you're an organization that offers a service as, a cloud management organization, or you store anybody else's sensitive data. So what this also addresses is that it brings in these impact levels of high, moderate, and low in terms of whether, what the impact of this data being leaked or of the impact of this data being stolen, what that would have on your organization. So something that's a high impact level would be something like a social security number, which obviously identifies one individual person within the world. So that would obviously have a high impact of being leaked, whereas something with a low impact would just be an individual's birthday, because that could be traced back to hundreds to thousands of people, within any given area. And now what needs to be taken into consideration with this is, even if something is a low impact piece of information, such as a birthday, if that is combined with another piece of information, a moderate piece of information, such as somebody's IP address, well, then the combination of those two pieces of information makes it easier for someone to identify exactly who that person is. So that's what sets it apart a little bit from the others. And the other requirement is that once an organization becomes aware of a breach, they are obligated to report this to their relevant supervisory body within 72 hours of the organization becoming aware. This gives the individuals who might be affected by this more time to determine whether or not their information has been leaked, take any sort of remedial actions they need to, and then to start an investigation as to, what went wrong. How did this breach occur? What are the effects of this breach? What data was leaked? And so on and so forth. So determining whether or not this applies to your organization can be a little bit confusing. So you're going to want to analyze your overseas operations, any sort of overseas donors, and what GDPR is based on is the physical location of anybody that your organization transacts with online. So to just give an example of this, because a common misconception is that your organization has to have a physical office or you have to have significant overseas operations. That's not entirely the case. So to give an example of something, a transaction that would be subject to GDPR, say you have an American citizen who resides in America and they contribute to your organization every year, have been doing so for the last decade. Your organization's based out of DC. Say this donor is on vacation, goes to Spain, which is a country located within the European Union, and they get a little reminder on their phone that says, it's time to make your annual donation to XYZ organization. They log into a terminal located within Spain that has an IP address in Spain. That transaction is technically subject to GDPR, which means that your organization is required to be GDPR compliant. Now, whether or not this one transaction is going to get flagged, and if, God forbid, a breach does occur, if that individual's information is leaked, whether or not this would be a finable offense or considered a significant breach is up to the relevant supervisory body. And going back to those fines, as you can see at the bullet point below, they are able to levy revenue-based fines up to 20 million euros or 4% of annual revenue. And another common misconception is that's not just the revenue that's attributable to your overseas transactions or anything that's subject to GDPR. That is global annual revenue for the entire year. Anything that was earned in the U.S. is subject to fine under GDPR. And then just going back to whether or not GDPR is relevant, and I know I've mentioned the cost versus benefit analysis for a number of things today, but if you believe that GDPR may be relevant to your organization, if you have foreign donors, whether or not it's a significant amount of transactions or a very small amount of transactions, just performing a cost-benefit analysis or even bringing in an outside party just to determine how far off your organization is from being compliant with GDPR and whether or not it's feasible for you all to make it so that your organization is entirely GDPR compliant. And with that, I think we'll just open it up to some questions from you all.
Thanks, Mac, and thanks, Ricardo. We have had some questions roll in throughout the course of the webinar, so I'm just going to read some of those. The first one, how important and what are the benefits of an IT risk assessment?
Great. I could take that one, Laura. So IT risk assessments are really important, and I'm going to mention three items that I think are really important here. First of all, an IT risk assessment or an IT audit, it helps identify the threats and vulnerabilities for the specific organization. So it digs a little deeper to find out, okay, here are the vulnerabilities, here are the threats, and it provides recommendations on how to help avoid or how to help minimize the vulnerabilities and obviously the threats. They also help determine if existing controls which are in place to secure the information assets are working effectively. So they would go in to analyze, okay, what kind of controls does the organization have in place currently, and are those good enough for the organization, or do some of those need to be strengthened or changed? And it also helps evaluate the efficiency of the entity's information system. How are different platforms and different software applications and also devices talking to each other? How are they related one to another? Is the IT department fully involved into all the applications that are currently running throughout the organization? Because this is really important. So again, really beneficial for organizations to think about having an IT risk assessment done within. And also, if cyber insurance, which again we highly recommend organizations to obtain cyber insurance, if the insurance provider knows that the organization has gone through an IT risk assessment, it also may help lower the premiums for the insurance as well.
Great, thank you, Ricardo. Another question that just came in, if my organization has a small amount of overseas activity, is it necessary to be GDPR compliant?
And I'll jump in and take this one, Laura. So this again, if you have a small amount of overseas operations, this again will just come back to performing that cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not it's worth bringing somebody in or an organization in to come in and evaluate your systems and determine, what needs to be done in order to be GDPR compliant. As you saw before, the fines can be pretty significant. So if your organization holds any sort of personally identifiable information from any sort of your overseas donors, I would say that performing a cost-benefit analysis of upgrading your systems and making sure you're GDPR compliant is essential for your organization. But again, it depends, just on how far off from being GDPR compliant is your organization. How much sensitive data do you actually hold on to? And in the event of a breach, what kind of data could be leaked? So depending on the size, depending on the nature of your operations and everything, it'll kind of differ from organization to organization. But yeah, I would say performing a cost-benefit analysis, if you have any sort of overseas operations and you're doing any sort of transacting with vendors or donors within the EU, that it would be crucial for you to look into just, how much it would be to upgrade your systems and make sure that you are GDPR compliant.
Perfect, thank you so much. I think we have time for at least one more question before we wrap up, and here's a good question. Can hackers be stopped?
Great question, Laura. I guess, they could be stopped for sure. And I think by implementing a lot of the security controls that we talked about, that would be very helpful. But a couple of things I wanted to add to that is organizations should really focus on their Active Directory or the domain controller. And this is sort of like the vault where all usernames and passwords are saved to give access to the organization's network. So this is a place where hackers are trying to get to so they can obtain, obviously, usernames and passwords to be able to navigate through the organization's network. So it's a good idea for the organization's IT department, IT team, to be able to analyze this and review it periodically to make sure that there are no usernames or passwords that should be inactivated. When employees are offboarded, they need to be offboarded. Also need to evaluate what the organization currently has, digital assets, devices, applications, and so on and so forth. And obviously gain the support from governance, from the board of directors, to be able to implement a lot of the security controls. And finally, use some reports. There's a good website called CyberArk, cyber and then ark.com, that offers some great reports to be able to help stop some of the hackers.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so with that, we'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, and we encourage you to always check our website for upcoming events and updates at grfcpa.com/events. And if you have any additional questions after today's program, please reach out to us. Our contact information appears here. And please remember to complete the survey that follows if you would like to earn CPE credit for attending today's webinar. Thank you so much for attending, and have a great day.